So the focus and place plan, I'll talk a bit about the purpose of today, but I also wanted to make the point that we're working alongside the council and a number of officers are here today, as well as a wider consultant team, PRD, Fletcher Priest Architects, Steer on transport, and the NTIA on nighttime and licensing considerations. Just the purpose of today, so people who are joining are clear that this is the second and final virtual webinar event. It leads on from the first public webinar event held on April the 19th, and it will help shape the future of Folkestone Town Centre. We've been listening to your views, as the leader has said, and today is an opportunity to hold our team to account that we've incorporating your suggestions as we co-develop the place plan. We're going to be focusing on specific opportunities and actions, what the place plan can do, how we make sure it has a positive impact. You'll be able to ask questions, share your views, and complete a survey. We'll talk about next steps at the end. So do feel free, as I go through this presentation, to put questions in the Q&A box, and we'll seek to answer those where we can as we go, if there are particular points of clarification. But ultimately, we're setting a good portion of time today between now and 7:30, setting aside a good portion of that session for Q&A so that we can respond directly to the questions that you have today and any other comments that will help us steer the process. I'll be seeking to stay on time as much as possible. I will first give a presentation of the developing place plan, approximately 35 minutes, and that will recap our programme and our work so far. It will recap on the place plan and missions that were presented at the last webinar back in April, and then we'll zoom in on a series of what we're calling action areas and explore those in greater depth. I will ask colleagues from Fletcher Priest, so Stina, who joined for the previous webinar, will be on hand to talk to a few slides as well as answer your questions. And my colleagues, Will and Emily, will also be here to answer questions. There are council officers here too, Lorraine Smith and Llewellyn Lloyd, and we also have the leader and Ewan Green here as well. So when it comes to Q&A, we have plenty of people on hand to answer the range of questions that you might have. So there is a bit of a recap here, and I will just, those of you that will have seen the first session, some of this you will have seen already, but I think it's worth just to set the scene again. I'll move through it quickly. But the place plan is focused on the core of the town centre. So that's the black line, as you see that here, with a wider area of context under consideration. That's kind of red dotted line, just worth recognising the extent of the area that we're talking about here today. In terms of our process so far, we're now a significant way through the overall process. We undertook at the beginning what we call an urban appraisal, so looking really carefully at what exists and how the place is functioning. We've also been through a significant amount of engagement, a series of one-to-one conversations, workshops, school focus groups, public events, and licensing workshops. And this is plugging into and leading into the strategy and the proposals, what we're calling the place plan, as well as a broad set of work around the licensing policy review and the draft of that. I'll talk about timings and next steps later on. I did want to reflect a little bit in this early part of the presentation on what we've learned so far. We've had 46 one-to-one conversations with key stakeholders, done 15 workshops, had 121 workshop attendees. We've had 188 attendees at the last webinar in April, and we've had 77 responses to the survey so far, and we'll be launching a new survey at the end of today's session. I did really want to, and some of these are quite wordy, there's quite a lot on some of these slides, and I'm not going to pick up on all these points, but know that the recording of this is going to be available, so you can go back over these when you're responding to the survey. But we want to prove that we're listening to you through this process. And so here we've, against a number of themes that were raised in the last webinar, kind of try to capture what you said and what we did. So a few key things as we go through here. But the first is that there's a desire to see use in the town centre that diversify and reflect the needs of the community. There's a need for low-cost spaces and charities in the town centre, and the town centre should include more green spaces, including safe areas for children. So what we're doing, we're testing a range of uses integrating community spaces within the town centre. You'll see that as I move through. We're identifying a strategy for onward engagement as well to make sure that this is part of a process and to think about green spaces, and particularly the reinstatement of Bouverie Square as a key public space. I will pause on that as we move through the presentation later on. The topic of heritage, culture and leisure has come up quite a lot too, of course. And in terms of the things that we're doing, we're continuing to develop a strategy to encourage evening uses and overnight stays. We're thinking particularly about the provision of spaces for young people in the town centre. And we are working with particular institutions and groups to do so. But as well, thinking about improving those connections to and from St Eanswyth's and the town centre. So there's a lot of consideration here, and hopefully you'll see how these are coming through into the proposals as we work through. Business and skills are critically important, and we've presented these considerations on this later on in the presentation today, but we certainly welcome your questions on these. You said that skills and training for young people is a way of addressing the economic disparities within the town, that the adult education offer is seen as insufficient, but we should be testing and pioneering alternative approaches, that ongoing support for startups and availability of workspace is a way of retaining the skilled workforce, and reasonable rent levels and rent relief can encourage business in the town centre. So we have specifically looked at opportunities for youth enterprise. We are looking at expanding the education offer of the Cube, and we're also looking at ways in which Folker and vacant units can act as hubs for testing new uses. Accessibility, safety, and cleanliness came up significantly in the last webinar. You said the lack of certain facilities such as changing places toilets make the town centre inaccessible to certain groups. We've addressed that in our proposals. Aspects around lighting and safety and cleanliness have come up a number of times in the prior webinar. So we have looked at particular public realm enhancements along with improvements to street lighting. We're continuing to work with Steer from a transport perspective on improving safety for pedestrians. And we're also looking at populating those vacant units in the town centre to make sure we're addressing that perceived sense of neglect. Transport and connectivity, there's a desire to see a strategy for transition to electric vehicles and low carbon transportation systems. Concerns about limiting provision of parking spaces within the town centre, and that traffic is perceived as having a negative impact on pedestrian experience and access to the coast. And parts of the town are present to cycle through, there's a desire to see that extended to other areas. So our proposals include to ensure that the environment of those roads are more conducive to safe walking and cycling. I'll show you examples of that later on. And the park and ride scheme and a mobility hub at the station and harbour area are something that we've included in proposals. And new vertical connections between the old town and the harbour. And then in terms of further work and ongoing engagement, I think it's worth just reflecting that the place plan is a stepping stone towards ongoing work and more activity that will take place through the kind of duration of the rest of this work, but also beyond the conclusion of the place plan and into the actions that the council and the partners might take. So there's a desire to develop further sustainability and a strategy for Folkestone's net zero agenda, to think about creating a young person shadow council, and a desire to see ongoing involvement from the council in some of the initiatives. So we are creating a long-term strategy to ensure youth involvement in the place plan and the ongoing steps. We've re-evaluated mission 6, and we'll talk about the climate crisis and biodiversity crisis and how that is being addressed in our proposals. And we're also making recommendations for long-term engagement strategies. So that's just a bit of a recap for those that did attend the last session or those that didn't, to understand some of the things that have come up through that earlier webinar. We have therefore adapted the place plan missions and challenges. So I just want to run through this quickly, and we'll pick up the Q&A towards the end. The grand challenge, as we have stated it, is to overcome decline in Folkestone's town centre by embracing opportunity, addressing the climate emergency, and celebrating what's already great and bringing the town's communities together. We've set out 6 missions that seek to achieve that, and then a series of actions to deliver those missions. And those actions have been split into 6 kind of co-supporting and interrelated areas, but we zoom in on each of these today to help understand those actions at a kind of fine grain level and what that looks like on the ground. I'll run through the missions kind of quickly. So there's 6 of those, and we have adapted both the grand challenge and mission 6 in response to the prior webinar, but it's worth saying that there's also significant support for the challenge and the missions as we set them out. So mission 1, celebrate what's great. Make the most of Folkestone's best assets, its coastline, its communities, its heritage and its creativity to attract visitors and enhance the lives of residents. The maps you see on the right-hand side here were shown before. I won't dwell on these too much, but these start to pick out from the appraisal work and the detailed analysis that we've done, some of the key ingredients that are going to be important to make sure that mission can be a success. Mission 2, the town centre for the future. So to reinvigorate the town centre core by identifying opportunities for a new range of uses, community services and employment opportunities. Mission 3, a place for all voices. So to work with the people of Folkestone to develop proposals that are meaningful to all, now and into the future. And so therefore, just the map here starting to show all those networks and assets in terms of community infrastructure, groups, public spaces, and other connections that are going to be important to make sure this mission can be a success. Mission 4, moving sustainably. So that's about creating a better environment that connects the town centre and the surroundings and supports active movement, enables healthy lifestyles and well-being. So particularly thinking about walking and cycling, but more holistically about what moving sustainably around Folkestone actually means. Mission 5 is about access to opportunity, and we'll pick this up in the town centre core proposals later on, but to embed opportunities for support, skills and training to allow all residents of Folkestone to benefit from change. And mission 6, to deliver sustainable quality. So ensure that all outcomes delivered by the council or other partners meet Folkestone's full potential for exemplary quality and address the twin crises of climate breakdown and biodiversity loss. And this, I think, is where we've heard your prior comments and that we sought to address these in proposals as they move forward. So I'm then going to zoom in to the actions against those missions. And we structure these, in some ways, each of these actions is about addressing the missions that we have set out and have we tested through the engagement so far. Certainly here today is definitely an opportunity to further test these actions. And of course, these areas of Folkestone are hugely interrelated, but to enable us to zoom in and look at these at a kind of granular level, we have to kind of carve it up into a jigsaw so that we can make sense of these individual components. But of course, that interrelationship, and it's worth considering how we zoom back out again and think about Folkestone as a whole. I'm going to go through each of these 6 areas just to flag that the Ship Street site isn't an area I'm going to focus on, but has a key relationship to opportunity and growth in the town centre. So the station arrival area. So there are barriers and footways, and narrow footways that are kind of constraining movement, a slightly underwhelming arrival from the station, but there are well-planted traffic islands. Here, and you might have seen this one before, but we look at particular moves that we can make to help support those missions, particularly about celebrating what's great and particularly about moving sustainably. I think it's not just the moving sustainably into the town centre, but also that connection to Radnor Park and Kingsnorth Gardens. So in each of these, and this is new, you'll be seeing this for the first time, we start to highlight some of those key projects and moves and actions that we think are going to be important. And we show here Preston images of how this has been achieved elsewhere in the UK and further afield. A little kind of tip, I suppose, about reading these drawings. These are kind of axonometric drawings, so taken from above. You can see some 3D aspects within these. But we've used colour to kind of denote where activity and change is most focused. So your eye can be drawn to the bits that are kind of coloured in. And just in here, I think some of the key important things are that public realm upgrades and new public spaces around the train station and a link to a new small public square as a gateway into Folkestone is going to be important. As we look down kind of Cheriton Road as well, to think about wayfinding and enhancing the cycling and walking experience. So the kind of connections, that's signage, that's kind of cycle lanes and kind of wider pavements, and the improvement to that public realm. There's also the opportunities, we think, to explore options for a bus link into the town centre, which could form part of a park and ride scheme. And to think more holistically about a mobility hub alongside the train station. So that's bike hire and other supporting uses that will require kind of work with Network Rail and others to bring such things forward. Moving through to the Sandgate Road West, I'm having to move through this at some pace here today because of time. But it's worth just kind of reflecting on some of the good things that exist in this area. But then as we look through to some of the other opportunities here, that really particular sites here along Sandgate Road West, and to think about the Sainsbury's site, for example, are opportunities that we're considering how the place plan can shape and steer kind of positive intervention that achieves these missions. I recognise there's quite a lot of words on some of these slides. These have been put together also so that people can consume these separately without presentation, but you will, if you watch the recording back, be able to spend more time looking at these. So when we think about that Sandgate Road West area, there are key opportunities, we think, around public realm upgrades and new public spaces. That's kind of reconfiguration of those spaces as well as new spaces. But the opportunity also to test new uses within units along Sandgate Road West. So where there are vacant units, to encourage landlords and occupiers to try new things is going to be important. This is not a challenge that's unique to Folkestone, of course. Plenty of towns around the country are going through similar challenges. And so it's worth reflecting on where you can learn good lessons from elsewhere. There are also opportunities to bring new uses and housing into the town centre, and those development opportunities have the potential to bring new footfall, family houses, as well as others, and to think about what people might need in a town centre when there are more people living there. Community involvement in choosing and testing uses is going to be an important part of the process as well, and to think about improved cycle parking provision within the street. As we move across to the town centre core, I think it's worth considering that there's already a lot to celebrate in terms of what's great here, but there are also some needs to make sure the town centre is kind of fit for the future and well-facing for the future. So there are a number of things here, key developments in terms of council-owned land, as well as the potential for the reinstatement of Bouverie Square, which is a key move. I'll zoom in on a couple of key areas here. But the upgrades to Guildhall Street, supporting the food market, we think have particular importance. The public realm upgrades to Sandgate Road are also a key move, as well as understanding how public seating, cycle parking plays into that, alongside things like tree planting and rain gardens. There are new opportunities around wayfinding and signage, but also to think about the town centre as a lab to test new uses, experiment and try new ideas. So reinvention is going to be required to produce resilience. And to think about things like the Volker building for new uses, medical provision, residential, leisure, commercial, and think about that in a short, medium, and long term. And also skills hubs to work with education institutions and businesses to bring those opportunities forward. Again, part of that you said, we did aspect. And there were a few points coming out of those testing new uses that it's worth reflecting on. And on the right-hand side, there are some key kind of precedents that we can learn good lessons from. Projects in Brixton, in Newcastle, and in Bodmin in the southwest. But Folkestone has a number of prominent property assets in public sector ownership, or where the council can exert influence. The devaluation in town centre property values has created an opportunity to rethink the way property is managed. So in the short term, provoke and enable new uses. And in the longer term, residents and businesses can come to recognise greater ownership of those public assets, working with third sector groups and partners to develop a socially oriented approach to town centre property could be a really good and strong thing. And then clearly, how we manage those assets against a suite of defined social and commercial aims is going to be important. So we have to think about how we can achieve that, and that requires a range of different agents to play a role from both the public sector and third parties within that. I think how we enable long-term participation through capacity building is also important. A great example is Everyone, Every Day in Barking and Dagenham, but there are other examples here, CoLab in Dudley, and there's this interesting project, Reimagining the Civic Commons in the US. But we have to, in terms of capacity building, think about how we stitch together the challenges of a divided and unequal community. And the town has a lot of potential. High proportions of working age people and a strong local creative sector. And the response of communities to the pandemic has shown that people want to be an active part of their community. So strong long-term community participation is something that we're looking to embed in proposals and in the place plan. And this approach can be incorporated through design, delivery, and kind of long-term operation. So that's part of that program of capacity building. And that participation should be focused on achieving positive outcomes through skills development, community cohesion, and the shared ownership of regeneration. I'm going to invite Stina to say a few words now.
Thank you, Oliver. So next two slides shows some ideas that we have just to look at some of these opportunity sites that Oliver's been talking around. And we've really taken the approach where we looked at the number of sites in the town centre to look at this through time, looking at what can be done immediately with kind of smaller interventions on meanwhile uses or pop-up stores or etc., through to more substantial redevelopment of some of these sites and the kind of guiding principles that we think should be guiding this. So the example here, this is Volker, and the council owned this building, has already started, it's being used as a vaccination centre. So a great kind of temporary use. Are there examples of things that we're looking at here temporarily is introducing new uses. So it could be leisure, or it could be a test bed for these kind of things that Oliver mentioned. And to achieve that, we're looking at opening up shop frontages, maybe adding awnings, bold graphics, and for it to make a statement in kind of the transformation of this building. Longer term, there's the potential to add more uses to this, and we can think that this could be a really hub for the town centre. And we're looking at adding potentially some residential homes above the Art Deco building. We're looking at other things, medical use, leisure use, community facilities, and workspace potentially. So none of this is fixed, but it's looking at how we can bring back this building as really as a key mixed use kind of hub on Sandgate Street. We go to the next one. The other building along Sandgate Street that we looked at is the former Bon Marché building. So in this instance, it's showing a retention of the existing building and really quite small tweaks to what we think is a quite quite a nice building, has good bones, and we're looking at what we can do with this building, and really looking at opening up and working with the ground floor, adding uses that complements what's in the town centre today. So it's not a big department store anymore, not a big shop, but looking at how we could subdivide and make smaller units into this that is more in demand. And then above that, looking at workspace and reconfiguring the building really to something that meets the demand. Throughout all these opportunity sites, what we've been doing is looking at how we can add uses to the town centre and strengthen what is a really great piece of Folkestone and make it more resilient. And by that I mean looking at how we can make it a bit less dependent on retail and big department store or big occupiers, and actually looking at how we can get other uses in there, if it's workspace or pop-up things or residential, community, health, etc. Yes,
Thank you, Stina. So I think some of the things we're considering alongside some of those residential uses and those opportunities to think about development also include, in this case, Bouverie Square and Middleburg Square. So here, I mean, this is the kind of the kind of bus station, but to reinstate Bouverie Square as a key arrival space and focal point to help build confidence for inward investment. So that's about relocating the bus station along Middleburg Square, to reconfigure carriageway through the square to improve the setting, and introduce rain garden, suds, greenery and trees to address the climate and biodiversity emergency as part of that, and to repurpose the building bus station as a kind of cafe function to think about some of those other uses that Stina has already talked about in and around the space around Bouverie Square. The opportunity for improved gateway to the town centre and to think about that new bus station layout, that's something we're working closely with Steer to explore. But here we're having to bring together a whole range of different kind of ingredients to make this part of the town centre work. Again, that relationship to the mobility hub with cycle hire and storage being important, where that's shared cars and cargo bikes, an information kiosk, smart lockers, charging points for electric vehicles, all these things we should be thinking about to make sure that Folkestone is kind of future-proof for some of the changes that we expect to see coming to town centres. And again, just thinking carefully about how we make skatable space within the town centre, in especially sanctioned skate areas. So here's just a view of the kind of the potential transformation for Bouverie Square, and to think about how that relationship can be kind of more holistically changed to be part of a great asset within the town centre. Moving across again to the Creative Quarter area. So there are obviously a number of different kind of ingredients going on in this part of the town centre. But I think we need to recognise that there is, and there are both some great assets, but also some challenges. And so, apologies if you can hear in the background, an ice cream truck has just pulled up outside my house. So if you can hear the bells of that, sorry for the disturbance. Part of what we need to do here within the Creative Quarter is celebrate what's great, think about town centre future, and make sure that we're considering those access to opportunity, a place for all voices, and how we move sustainably. Zooming in, that requires us to think kind of imaginatively, particularly around Payers Park and the edges, I suppose, to Payers Park, and quite equally to consider the areas around F51. So there are, of course, I think, a range of public realm upgrades that around the Cube, F51 and Payers Park that could start to stitch together portions and the backs of areas here, or what we view as the backs, but I recognise other people might not, but part of our appraisal that has thrown out some interesting queries. To think about a hub of potential uses around Payers Park and to think how those uses can help activate, improve safety, to address lighting and frontage and routes through the space and connectivity to other parts of the town centre. to support Shepway Youth Hub with larger spaces, the redesign of the road layout to improve all modes of travel. So thinking about kind of changes to Dover Road and the closure of the section of Dover Road in front of F51 to kind of de-gyratory that system to make more space for people, whilst looking very carefully at how that doesn't produce undue impacts on movement by other vehicle modes. And to think also about promoting a kind of leisure loop and other active routes circuits around the kind of wider area. Thinking particularly, and I mentioned in the kind of earlier part around considerations around culture as well as heritage. So to think about that coastal area and the heritage quarter is something that we've been considering quite carefully. Of course, that area around the Remembrance statue, as I move on, you'll start to see. And I think there's certain things here which have come to the fore through our kind of place plan work, particularly the area around the Remembrance statue with the Isom building to the one side and Aspen House to the other. And to think about that connectivity in relationship to wider development in the area and those links down to those other parts of the town centre. So as we look here and think about how we support heritage, again, the public realm upgrades around the Road of Remembrance and particularly the War Memorial statue offer opportunities for significant kind of transformation, ones that can improve connectivity, can improve the quality of the public realm, can improve lighting and seating and places for people to pause as well as to travel through safely. I think those improved connections and better visibility around the church is obviously going to be important. And to think also, not in development terms necessarily, but think about how facade improvements and frontage improvements to some of those key buildings can start to help address and create better streetscape. The Isom building and the car park to again explore what the options are around that so that those kind of positive transformation can impact on the adjacent area as well. And I think one of the things that has come up through a lot of dialogue is that seamless connection from the station to the coast and between the coast and the heritage quarter, to think about how we make those routes legible, attractive and safe, and highlight and amplify the things that people care about in Folkestone. So to think here about the potential transformation around the memorial and the Road of Remembrance, to think about what that change could be to road and footway layout that makes space for people, and the potential kind of transformations and activation of the ground floor uses around those areas. And then moving down to the harbour and sunny sands, again, a whole set of other ingredients that need to come into play that should make Folkestone an overall success. Oh, sorry, to skip back slightly. So here is, I think, particularly thinking about leisure and recreation related to the water, and a number of ideas that have been well received through our dialogue with many people through this process so far. But I think there are some challenges and some particular projects that we have looked at within this. They include particularly kind of that tram road area. And there's a few examples here you'll see about how we can start to make space around that kind of Harbourway car park to become a key public space, incorporating aspects such as the urban room, and to think about the tram road improvements itself in terms of shared pedestrian and cycle routes, seating, planting and moments for pause, and to be cognizant of the changes that would have in terms of accommodating buses into East Folkestone. And I think, again, the opportunity to think carefully about climate and biodiversity emergency, thinking about sustainable drainage and carbon sequestration, could be something that could form part of this area within the place plan. So to think about that kind of tram road area and that kind of transformation through there. And then moving across kind of sunny sands, I think that the thing we've heard about a lot, I think, is the opportunities around leisure and recreation, as well as the infrastructure that's needed to support those activities. So to expand the public toilet and shower offer at Sunny Sands to ensure the beach is accessible to all, that's a key thing that has come through. And that should include, as you would have seen earlier on from the You Said We Did, kind of changing places toilet provision. To think about well-being and sports activities supported along the coast more broadly, water sports and kayaking, etc., and to think about how those are promoted and supported, and what infrastructure is required to accommodate equipment and to encourage family-friendly and accessible activities. And the potential to explore options for a natural tidal pool, shown here in the top right of the image, and to think about how that produces summer jobs and training opportunities, particularly for young people alongside that kind of recreational offer. So that's quite a quick-paced move through those proposals as they're currently represented. I did just want to touch on how this ultimately comes together, because I think what you see from that is a huge range of opportunities identified within the emerging place plan, moving through from the grand challenge to the missions and those action areas. And that what we are then doing are thinking carefully about how we set and analyze priorities to make sure that we're thinking about impact and outcomes, the reliance on other actions and action by others. So who owns those actions? That not all of that, of course, in terms of the things we've been talking about, falls directly to the council, and to think about costs. So how do we make sure when we prioritize things that Folkestone, its residents and its businesses get the best bangs per buck from investment that can be leveraged through the place plan? And just to say, there's obviously a series of technical and supporting appendices from the urban appraisal, the transport and movement studies, and the opportunity site testing that Stina alluded to as well. So we're looking carefully at those. So I've focused today on things that include kind of visual material, but there's a lot of very detailed work behind this. Ultimately, the place plan leads to a set of next steps and related work. So that will investigate further studies and work on priority projects. That will, of course, include further dialogue and engagement with you here today, as well as a range of others who will be directly and indirectly affected by those projects. But there's also some next steps in terms of a licensing policy statement that's essentially being reviewed as part of the process at the moment. And then to think carefully about this place brand as well, and that's an ongoing and next steps piece of work that doesn't form one of the key outcomes from the place plan, but ultimately this work and the recommendations we make will help support that being something that pushes in a consistent and good direction to achieve the missions and the asks that we've heard of from Folkestone's communities. So just, this is obviously very small text, but just to give you a sense of how we are then starting to analyze, scope and prioritize those actions that have been set out, and ultimately think about how that leads towards robust funding bids. That might be to the Levelling Up Fund, which you might have heard about, the UK Prosperity Fund, but also identifying where other stakeholders, such as Network Rail or Cycling UK or others, might be best placed to pursue particular projects, so that the range of proposals we've shown add up to a kind of greater whole, and that we can relate these back to where there's interdependency between other actions, and to relate those to the missions that have been kind of widely tested through this process. So that brings me to the end of this presentation section and into the Q&A section. And I therefore have a number of open questions. I'm just going to look across to the Q&A box here, and what you can do, if you're those that are seeing these open questions, there are a number that have been marked as answered already, but there are a number of open questions that I'll go through. you can upvote those questions to raise them up the stack, if you like. And so I'm going to start at the top of these, and I will read out these questions, and then I will also call on other panelists here today who might want to answer some of these questions. So the first question is from Philip. He says here that I said the NTIA were bringing forward the nighttime licensing policy. We thought the whole licensing policy was being reviewed. Which is it? So Philip, what NTIA and the council are currently doing is going through that review process. That will run beyond the timescales for the kind of place plan, because that takes a greater amount of time to bring some of those considerations to a conclusion. The point that was set out in the kind of in this slide a couple of slides ago is that will ultimately lead through to a licensing policy statement, and colleagues in the council can come on this too, but that will be subject to kind of further consultation processes, as I understand it, before any licensing policy is confirmed and adopted.
Yes, Oliver, I might just add a bit to that, please.
Do come in, Ewan. Yes, of course.
Thank you. Yes, the work of We Made That and the NTIA is helping us shape the new policy. And it's important we think that what happens in the place plan is reflected in our consideration of the new policy, but it definitely is a new licensing policy that we will be taking through council. We have to do that because of the time period this year is lapsed, and so every 5 years we do review the policy. So certainly, Philip, it definitely is the full policy that will be reviewed, but we absolutely want to make sure that what comes out of the place plan helps shape the policy, and vice versa, that the policy is there to support delivery of the place plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Ewan. Thank you, Emily. The next question, those that may want to come in, I actually will also invite a few people to ask their questions to the group in a second. There is a question from John O'Connor, which he says, it's notable that some of the strongest concerns around sustainable quality of life residents were expressed in the licensing session. Routine nightly ASB, which offers entertaining drinkers. I won't go into all this question here. But the point I think, John, you're making is, how is this realism of life in the town centre fed into strands of thinking around a balanced local economy, further refining of planning processes, and above all, a plan for a continuous consultation or voice for the community so that local people can continue to contribute ideas and see the council will address these constructively. John, I don't know if you were there for the opening kind of you said we did, but I think one of the key things we've heard a lot from is that how do we set processes in place that ensure that as the place plan develops into specific projects, that's also an opportunity to embed opportunity, that's the opportunity to embed engagement. There's an opportunity also to make sure that, as you say, continuous consultation, but a more participative process is set out. We will, in the place plan, be making recommendations for how that can be kind of progressive, continuous consultation. Clearly, some of the things we're talking about here move between kind of public domain, so things that are within the council's gift to be dealing with, and they also move into the domain of how do we encourage private landowners and property owners to play a constructive part of the process too. And so I think part of this is having a place plan that has built a degree of consensus through the process. And you will have seen in the early slides me talking about the numbers of people we've spoken to, but of course this is part of the process we've gone through, but by no means the end. I think what's been very heartening for us as a consultant team is just how open the council and the council officers and leadership have been in being open to questions, dialogue, to make sure that the public is genuinely engaged through this process. It doesn't go without saying that that's not always the case in the place where we work, and I think we've been delighted to find that there is a clear commitment to that being embedded in the work now, but ultimately making sure that's also embedded in the onward steps as we move beyond the place plan, which will include a whole range of different actors in those onward steps, including community and civil society groups. Certainly, I think that's going to be a key tenet of what we set out in terms of those missions and moving forward. I've got a few things skipping around. Susan's got a point saying, please don't have shared cycle and walkway. It doesn't work. So we are exploring these things. I suppose that's more of a comment than a question. There are, and I think actually we've seen a range of different things that have evolved in terms of the safe and sustainable way in which cyclists and pedestrians can be mixed. But we also recognise there's points where there's also guidance governing how and where separation should take place. So we have been with steer, and I recognise that as I've been through this presentation quite quickly and in a relatively illustrated form, we have been considering very carefully where it's appropriate for cyclists and pedestrians to mix and where segregation is required. That also, of course, needs to consider the relationship to vehicles and hazards as well. My understanding is that before any project would be implemented that would make significant changes to that dynamic, that there would be kind of further consultation on those, and that would be an opportunity to make sure that accessibility groups and others are part of that dialogue to develop such proposals. Just to, I guess, answer your question, I think we have seen, and the precedents and examples that some of those that we've used, we have seen where they have been really had to have a very positive effect of having that shared space. It sometimes means that there's kind of lower speeds, that that children and young people are more confident at cycling where they are not being put in the carriageway or being encouraged to go in the carriageway. So there are some benefits, and I think that's I think your question points at it, but of course benefits and threats have to be weighed up carefully as part of those onward steps. Moving on, and do please continue to kind of upvote these questions. I think colleagues, where possible, will answer questions in written form where that's. I'm just going to there's a couple of questions here around the bus station, Bouverie Square, and low energy and carbon neutral transformation. I think those all have a relationship. So we will be having further dialogue with bus operators around the station. Of course, that's part of the ongoing stuff. And I think that Matthew, you had met with my colleague Will Beeston. So I wonder if Matthew Arnold, you'd want to be invited to ask your questions kind of verbally to the group. If Emily, do you want to enable Matthew Arnold to ask his question and make any points?
Hi Matthew, I've just enabled you to talk if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi Oliver, thank you. So we've had a look. Sorry, I'm Matthew Arnold, Commercial Director for Stagecoach, and we want to understand a little bit more about the plans that were outlined last time and how they've developed, because this is a critical bit of infrastructure for Folkestone, and you know I speak on behalf of really the thousands of passengers that are using our services every day rather than us as a business. So it's really important that we have a more detailed conversation about this really at the earliest opportunity.
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah, we'd absolutely welcome that, and I think Steer's involvement, of course, means that there's a broader set of considerations. I'd understood that yeah, well, of course, we'd enter into further dialogue with you to make sure that what we're developing here is kind of fit for purpose and works for your purposes too. There's a kind of comment here about the bus station being convenient. And I think the key thing here is, as you talk about your kind of thousands of customers, absolutely, I think that we really value the bus transportation as being a really key part of the town centre. And so we wouldn't want to compromise that, the use of that, or the long-term sustainability of that being a viable transport option for the people of Folkestone or people visiting Folkestone. And so I think that's key. There's obviously a range of things that we'd have to do to develop proposals around that. And I think both Matthew Arnold has outlined that there's more dialogue that would go into that process. The point around knocking down Bouverie House, that's actually, we are considering the configuration of things around there, and ourselves and Stina have looked in more detail, but that's something that will need kind of further development and consideration from us, of course, in dialogue with stakeholders too. The kind of question, I suppose, which is related, are we including a low energy carbon neutral transportation strategy for the town? We are looking at the kind of those broader kind of transport potentials within the town centre. Steer's involvement in the place plan has shaped some early thinking, but there will be onward steps that we'll need to consider and the council will need to consider around that. I don't know if any officers on the call would like to come in and think about that kind of longer term relationship to transportation. Ewan, maybe.
I think just a broader comment about sustainability, and the council has set out very strong statements about its ambition around sustainability in its corporate plan, but also is bringing forward a carbon management action plan as well, with significant resources and actions coming through from that. So the important piece of work that we will be doing is making sure that this place plan aligns effectively with these two key drivers for the council to ensure that we're picking up on carbon reduction and sustainability as strongly as possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Ewan. I'm going to come back to Chris Beddoes' question here. Sorry, Chris, if I got your surname incorrect. His question is, how does your place plan incorporate the new Roger Duhan Seafront development with all its transport, retail, residential and social proposals? It doesn't feature anywhere on your proposals. Is there a reason why? So we haven't, it was dotted in actually and shown in one of those views, but please be reassured that that as part of our kind of appraisal work, all that has been very closely kind of considered. So that of course that what we want to make sure we're doing with the proposals that we're developing within the place plan is that we're demonstrating how they are complementing the other aspects that are in the pipeline already. We didn't think that it was quite right in the kind of place plan and we haven't shown in our illustrations, for example, forthcoming things that aren't yet in existence, because I think that can sometimes lead people to think that that's something that is being proposed as part of the place plan. So we've tried to, I suppose, split those things, but it was dotted there. And we are considering those things as part of our work as well. And yeah, the kind of the questions around kind of viability around that, if that might be something that you're kind of pointing at as well, is something that is obviously going to be considered through the kind of appraisal of projects as well. Just going back to the questions that are coming in thick and fast, thank you. Question from Phil Blades, I think it is. Do I assume that a tram or shuttle between station, town centre or harbour is too expensive to be considered? Will, or Emily, can I invite you to come in terms of some of the considerations that Steer have been giving to the kind of broader transport aspects?
We haven't looked specifically at a tram, but it is that Steer have been obviously looking at how the traffic network can be improved and how there could be space for more direct bus routes. So, for example, up Tram Road And in terms of a link between the station and the town centre, we do see that as very important, and have suggested that a bus route should be explored, because I think from Steer's point of view, a tram would be too expensive, but that link is really important. So I think it would be a case of working with Stagecoach again and looking at options for the bus link.
Thank you, Will. I think the other thing we're considering are those mobility hubs that I'd highlighted earlier on. I think those are key things that need to fit within that kind of overall network. Did anyone from the council want to come in on that kind of broader tram question? Because I know it's obviously a topic that has been bouncing around for a long time.
Well, I think the comment I would make is that I'm happy to think about anything in relation to the connectivity at the moment, as we're still forming, but the harbour line is very much an important asset and a project potentially coming out of the place plan, and that's potentially an important connector between that end of town and the harbour. So I think that's a consideration that we might want to think about. Although a tram, I do think would be very difficult unless there's a commercially viable way of doing it. But happy to consider anything in terms of that connectivity piece. Thanks.
Thank you, Ewan. So I'm just checking out the Q&A stacking up here. Bob Eden, can I invite you to ask your question to the group, please? And just to explain that a little further. If I got your surname right, sorry if I mispronounced it. Bob,
I think so. Am I connected?
We can hear you, yeah.
Good. Yeah, my thinking is, I mean, everything I'm hearing is to do with Folkestone and talking with Folkestone residents, which is clearly a proper thing to do. But Folkestone is part of the whole district. I live between Folkestone and Ashford, and I'm sort of interested in to what degree I should I can be assisted in choosing between Folkestone and Ashford on the basis of what it's offering me as a district resident, because otherwise, you know, what I would call local visitors into the town is an important part of it. Now, there's clearly some indication of things happening around the station and that sort of thing for ease of transport and that sort of thing going on. But I'm just wondering, to what degree are you seeking views from outside the study area or very close to it, and to what extent will you take account of that?
Thank you, Bob.
That's it, really.
Thank you. I'll try and answer that question, but of course there may be others, such as Lorraine, might want to come in on broader points. But we're not saying you must be from or live in Folkestone for your views to be valid in this process. We have been speaking to numbers across the kind of wider district. I think that relationship, that clearly our job in this particular case is to define Folkestone's offer. And you mentioned Ashford, but Ashford of course needs to define its own offer, and those things won't be the same and they won't deal with the same ingredients. I suppose one of the key things that we need to make sure we're doing is thinking that, of course, that Folkestone doesn't exist in isolation, and that it's dynamic with other places, with other residents, with other kind of economic centres, as well as kind of talk about leisure and recreation. I talk about kind of the visitor economy. There is, of course, a need for Folkestone to both stack up against other places, competitors, but also complement the other things happening in the broader area. So those things are things that we have been considering. So as we've looked at those precedents and case studies, as we've looked at some of the broader socioeconomic and impact considerations, those are things we considered. And ultimately, as the council moves forward to think about how it might secure funding for some of the things that people want to see in the place plan, the council will need to make its case to those funders, be that central government or be that kind of various heritage or cultural bodies, that they'll have to set out their stall in that way. But in terms of whether other people's views are valid, absolutely. I think we haven't said you must be from a Folkestone postcode in order to answer these questions.
Yes,
Ewan, did you want to come in?
Yeah, if I could just add, and I think, Bob, it's a really great question, and it's actually getting to the whole nub of the matter. That the whole point of this plan is about a viable, sustainable and prosperous future for Folkestone as a town that serves its district well. And therefore, it's about improving the offer that currently exists, and also promoting the fantastic assets that Folkestone has as much as possible to ensure that people across the district can benefit from it. So I think it's a really good point to make. Thank you. And certainly it gets right to the heart of the reason we're doing the place plan. Thank you.
On a related point, I'll come back to some of the other questions. Laura Davison asked a question, but Laura, do you want to maybe come in and ask this question yourself so we can, Emily, do you mind allowing Laura Davison to pose her question to the group? Laura, go ahead.
Thank you. Yes, my question was about the range of voices that have been engaged in the consultation process. So demographically, from equality groups, geographically, economically, and for example, young people. You mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that you'd had 77 responses to the survey. What do you think of that as a response level? Are you worried about it? And how will you expand and make sure we do have representative participation in the process?
Thank you, Laura. I think Emily will probably come in on this point as well, but one of the things that we've been trying very hard to, and I've talked already about taking progressive approaches to participation as part of this project, but it has been multi-stranded. I think that multi-stranded approach to engagement and participation has picked up different people in different ways, I suppose, across and kind of as a result of the pandemic as well. We've been thinking very carefully about where has that digital divide not enabled some people to join calls like this today because they simply don't have the tech, the space, the appetite to participate in this way. So we have been doing a number of different things. The survey is just one way of doing that, and I think we are releasing another survey at the end of today's session to enable more voices to be heard. But Emily, do you want to come in and talk a bit about the wider kind of demographics that we've been reaching?
Yeah, absolutely. Just to reiterate what Oliver was saying, really, we've tried to work as hard as we possibly can with Folkestone High to spread the word as wide as possible, and we've worked with them right from the very beginning to develop a list of over 350 individuals and groups that we've been contacting on regular occasions about the public events, and obviously invitations to the workshop as well. And that list includes many schools and colleges in particular, and we've held 3 specific workshops with school groups as well of different ages. And just to confirm that the 77 responses are on top of all the questions that were discussed and answered at the first public webinar. So that was sort of an opportunity for people to ask questions who hadn't attended the event. So, we had 188 attendees at that event, and then those 77 responses were kind of on top of those questions and answers that were part of the discussion at that event. So I do hope that answers your question a little bit. I'm very happy to expand on the details a little bit more if you have further questions.
Thank you, Emily. Laura, was there anything else further to add to your question?
If you have any figures that you could share, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, we are tracking that. It'll be part of our kind of final reporting, and in some ways, I think what we expect to find from that too is that we'll learn a number of. I think our reach has been good, but I think we also will learn a number of lessons about where, as projects develop out of the place plan, how we can target and ultimately be more impactful with engagement and participation approaches, particularly with kind of harder to reach groups and those that might not otherwise normally engage in these processes. One of the things that I think we find is, in the nicest way possible, I suppose, that we're dealing with a kind of paper exercise. This is a place plan. It's something that is, the outcome of this is a document and a PDF and these kind of things. But we also know from our broader work that really different people like to engage with projects in different ways. So when it gets to the kind of the delivery end of projects, then different people want to engage with those processes. So if that's around kind of community planting, if that's around shaping uses in Falker, these kind of things offer other opportunities for broader demographics to get involved as well. So we have to be kind of mindful about how we enable that as part of our processes, and we'll be setting out recommendations and lessons learned from our process so far.
Just to add one final point on that, there is also an equality and diversity survey attached to the survey as well that will be going out again. So of course that is part of tracking and reflecting back the sort of balance of those who've been engaged.
Thank you. And thank you, Laura. I have a question from Richard Wallace that relates to the Lees lift. And I know that Lorraine has been having some conversations with those groups just recently. Lorraine, the question is, apart from the Lees Pavilion and there's a Lees lift, can we have confirmation that vertical travel here is a planning obligation and necessity and must be heritage and integrate a cafe and proposed WC facilities? I think maybe your conversations most recently, Lorraine, are relevant here.
Sure. I probably can't answer the planning one, unfortunately, but I meet, as an ED officer, I meet regularly with the charitable board, and I think they went out with a press release today that they have put forward a bid to the National Lottery, the Heritage National Lottery bid. That was put in last week, and that was confirmed via a press release today. So that's quite hot off the press today.
Thank you, Lorraine. I'm just scanning through these questions to make sure. I'm just going to check on the timings of things. We're going to just run a little bit over because I recognise that we will answer these questions. Any questions that I don't get to, because I think as I talk, more questions arise. But any questions that aren't answered here, we'll follow up with kind of clarification written clarification after the meeting. I can see one that's been upvoted here, and it is that Grace Hill Library is a magnificent building in public ownership that should be more of an opportunity. Could it be part of the aforementioned boost to adult education? Strange, it's hardly mentioned. Will or Emily, do you want to come in and talk about any kind of considerations you've given to kind of Grace Hill Library? But I will just say, as my colleagues come in on this, that we had a very interesting discussion with councillors the other day, exactly about the role that libraries have taken during the pandemic, but also the role that libraries will emerge out of kind of the pandemic to think about their role in the town centre. So, Will, Emily, do you want to come in on this at all?
Yeah, only that it is a good point that it has been slightly sort of omitted from the place plan so far. It's not that it hasn't been considered, and yeah, as Oliver says, its kind of current use function during the pandemic is interesting, and yes, libraries and adult education obviously really interlinked and important, and as you say, it's a magnificent building in an interesting part of town, so I think we should give it more consideration going forward. As we
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Richard. Yeah, that's one for us to take away and I think respond to. I can see this is Dylan Jeffrey has made a point to ask a question, and I suspect with this particular point that this relates to planning and development control. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give a suitable answer to this. Llewellyn might be able to comment on this, but this might be something we have to return to as a written answer. Llewellyn, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Oliver. I'm happy to try and address it. So recently this was subject of a prior approval application to the council, whereby the conversion of building is already granted by central government, and they applied to the council as whether full approval should be required. In this case, it wasn't appropriate. We have a current application in for the refacing of the building, which is currently out to consultation. And if panelists or residents wish to comment on the application, they are able to do so at the moment to give us their views on what they think of the external appearance of the building going forward. I hope that helps.
Well, Oliver, could I add to that? Just in
Do
terms
please, Tina. Yeah, do come in.
not wishing to confuse with the imagery we put in there. I think the key really with these kind of the images and illustrations, so more the principle, in this case, the principle of retaining uses, active ground floor uses. So we were showing combination of shops and kind of cafes and restaurants or other more active uses, as opposed to something that is completely closes off the ground floor. And for throughout the study that we've been doing, it's really articulating some principles for the buildings as they might be coming forward, as the council are not controlling all of or owning all of the assets or all the opportunity sites that we've been looking at. So it's more around a kind of identifying key areas that we should look at and highlight as these come forward as developments. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Stina. I'm aware there's a fair few questions still unanswered. I did just want to maybe just take a moment to set out the next steps that we're moving from here, and have the leader just make a few kind of final remarks, and then we can come back to further questions. So I think some of these questions relate to next steps, which might be useful for you to see. So I think you're still seeing my shared screen, and I'll just take a couple of minutes myself and a couple of minutes on the leader just to make some points, and then we'll come back round to further questions, particularly around next steps and other things. And unanswered questions here we can come back to as time allows up until 7:30. So just from me in terms of next steps, and I'll hand over to the leader. The video, the webinar content and the FAQs collated and published on the project website will be available. We will post both these things in the chat. I believe my colleague Emily will do this. The online survey on the webinar will be live until the morning of Friday, the 25th of June. So that, and I think Emily's mentioned that already. That we will continue to develop proposals based on the feedback received, and there are kind of key points made here today, some of which we have as things we're wrestling and dealing with, and other things which I think are good points that have been made that we should go away and reflect on and make sure that we're addressing. That we will need to look carefully based on the feedback we receive to establish the priorities, the impacts and the outcomes against those actions. And there's clearly, as part of that, to investigate further studies and work on priority projects such as transport and parking and site development. I see there's a number of kind of questions around parking in the Q&A portion of the chat. So some of those are subject to kind of further investigative studies. That the draft place plan will be published for comment in mid-July. That's a kind of current timescales, and that will go to full council on 21st July, and then ultimately anticipated for the final place plan document towards the end of July.
Oliver, could I just?
Oh yes.
Sorry, I think the direction of travel for the document initially is to our cabinet.
Sorry. Okay. Maya, thank you for clarifying. Does the leader want to come in and say a few words? I'll just check he's still.
Yep. Thank you, Oliver. Yeah, a very interesting set of questions. It is this place plan that has been waiting for a long, long time, and I'm very pleased it's coming forward. It won't please everybody. We can be absolutely sure of that. What I have asked We Made That to do is give us a hierarchy of priorities, taking into account the feasibility of doing things. We have a unique opportunity at the moment because the government has a levelling up fund, and it enables us to actually put in a bid for something really quite expensive, which we wouldn't normally get to look at those funds. So I'm really looking forward to the outcome of this. A lot of the questions that you have asked are questions that exercise our minds all the time. The parking situation, whether the Bouverie Square ought to revert back to, or not revert back, become an open area, and the objections to that because of the good bus service we get, I absolutely agree with. So we've got to sort of somehow arrive at a compromise. But what I can say is that all your suggestions and comments are taken into account and will be used by, we made that to incorporate in their plan. So carry on with your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to come off screen sharing now and come back to the Q&A function. I'm just going to go through some more, and I'm aware that sometimes some of the key topics are kind of missed somewhat. So I'm just going to run through these, and we've got the last few 10 minutes. I think some of these can be answered separately, but the one point I just want to make here is that from Mark is the chat is starting to do the scrolling away from what you're reading like the last time. I think that's just the nature of how questions are answered and where people are kind of upvoting things. Last time we got the slides afterwards, but not a summary of the questions and concerns in the Q&A, and the box disappeared as soon as the meeting ended. Could we please get a printout of the chat this time, please? My understanding is that we do a kind of an FAQ of these things, Mark, so we can from this session and webinar today, we can pull these as part of that overall kind of process, so we'll make sure that's attended to. I'm going to skip back to the top in terms of the people that are kind of voting those up. There is a question from Lizzie Stewart about what are the plans for the Grand Burston Hotel in the harbour area. It's a very shabby old building and it really brings down the area. I think the challenge, I suppose, of that is that the council's in a position to do very little other than encourage, because the building's in private ownership. So we haven't made any explicit proposals in the place plan, but recognise that how we encourage investment and to address some of the areas around that is going to be part of the process. But we have no kind of direct leverage on that one, I'm afraid, Lizzie. Although I agree that I think the challenges of having buildings and vacancy and things in poor repair have an onwards effect on the things around them, but that means we have to think carefully about where and how we invest to deliver that kind of best bangs per buck. Up the top here, I think, is Mark. You made it to the top of the stack. Some points around a trial of the park and ride to the harbour from the car park at the end of Sheraton Road, and I think there's a number of points you make here. I think just picking through the question slightly, I don't think you make a particular question as such, but it does mean that the result of some of those movement functions and the kind of pricing of those stops, etc., means that people are discouraged from staying and having a meal in Folkestone to the detriment of the restaurants in Folkestone. I think that's a good point, and something we're considering as part of this. Actually, how do we make sure that when we're talking about encouraging a range of uses, we're talking about encouraging people to dwell and spend time in the town centre, that we consider that alongside transport infrastructure as well. And I think the timings of buses, the routing of buses, and other kind of modal transport choices will come into that as well. I'm just skimming down through these.
Oliver, I think Leader would like to say something.
Of course, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. It's just on the park and ride. It is a trial. You will have discovered that one of the big problems is going to be in the future, if everybody's still got a car, is parking. As we develop Folkestone, more and more the places people park now come under threat. And so this is purely a trial to see if it can work. And I agree with several of the points made in the question, that I would love it to go from 9 o'clock in the morning to 9 o'clock at night. But there is a cost, and this is a trial, and this trial is going to cost us money to do. So we've got to be a little circumspect. And as to where it stops, that is under review. We said we'll run it for 2 weeks and then review it, and so we will do that. I think it will be the way of the future, that if we want to attract people into the town, we don't want them all driving their cars into the town, and if we can set up some park and rides on the periphery, that'll help the town enormously. Thank you, Oliver.
Thank you, Leader. I'm just going to come down to a point which I think has just suddenly dropped down the stack for some reason, but from Daniel Keating. The success of the town centre depends on ease of access and egress. Car travel, including taxis, is a major mode, but there is nothing to improve this, particularly car parking. Is this particularly relevant to all the citizens? What can be done to make access easier for all? So yeah, I think we are considering accessibility, so it's worth recognising that different transport modes and choices benefit different people in different ways. So that ranges from walking and cycling through to public transport and private vehicles. That's the bit of work that we've already talked about in terms of Steer looking at more carefully. That's not just, I think, in terms of egress and access to the town centre, but more broadly across the district into neighbouring places. So that is something we're considering, and there is kind of very clear kind of equalities guidance around those different modes. But it is worth saying that we are considering the kind of access issues and how they affect different communities. I'm just moving down. There's 5 minutes remaining. I just want to make sure that some people who I think some people have asked multiple questions, but just coming down to here. Gordon. I don't see any new parking facilities for existing and proposed new housing, as well as visitors to the town. If the car park next to the Saga building and Sainsbury's is redeveloped, we lose around 1,000 parking spaces. So I guess this goes in the camp as well of broader considerations as we look at those development opportunities that Stina from Fletcher Priest was talking about, but also the work from Steer needs to consider the kind of impacts of those. One of the things I suppose I would just kind of flag is that you also want space in your town centre to be contributing to the kind of maximum benefit of the kind of wider community as well. And so to have good uses and good occupiers and things happening that do that is going to be important. And I think that any changes to parking will be subject to kind of further review and surveys and those kind of things as well. So I think that was a matter of course. But Sina, I don't know if you wanted to come in terms of provision of parking in relation to residential development in and around the town centre.
Yeah, yes, of course. Only to really reiterate what you were saying. So I think we're not saying that all these developments are completely car free. For each site, we need to look at how you can accommodate car parking at a good kind of good numbers. There were some questions around the car parking, specifically around the Sainsbury site, and that's the kind of the car parking that is related to the store today. What we were looking at there is retaining the potential of retaining a food store, but just making better use of the site and looking at stacking uses. And in that case, you would have to look at ways of accommodating car parking within that site as well. So not at all saying just get rid of all the car parking and build. We know that what the complexities are. These are always the questions that we grapple with in all kind of higher density or mixed use schemes. So absolutely, we need to come back to those questions when we look at it, when each site is being looked at.
Thank you, Stina. I am aware that there were a number of questions that we haven't had the opportunity to answer, but we are very shortly due to draw to a close. So just in terms of the next steps from here, my colleague Emily has put the links in the chat to find the survey and feedback form, and that the presentation and video will be published online shortly, and Emily has provided the link in the chat box. The other questions that have gone unanswered will come back on those through kind of the FAQ process. I'm aware that a number of you, I think, have already reached out to council officers on some of these specific questions as well, so those will be answered in due course. I did want to thank you for your time this evening. I think it's been always very useful to understand and hear opinion from kind of wider communities in terms of the process that we're going through in developing the place plan. I think it's been, I suppose, heartening for us anyway to see that there is a high level of interest in terms of shaping Folkestone's future. That's not always the case in terms of the places that we work. And I think that strength that comes from people's interest and commitment to the town is going to be the thing that carries it through in terms of resilience, particularly as we think about the kind of short-term challenges that Folkestone is kind of suffering from. I include the pandemic in that kind of suffering, is something that the community interest and civil society interest is going to be something that is going to really enable some of the transformations that we're talking about in the place plan. So yeah, thank you for everyone for attending today. Do please fill out the survey and feedback forms, and you can visit the Folkestone Hythe, Folkestone Place Plan website link to find out more and keep abreast of further information. But thank you today. Sorry I haven't had the opportunity to answer every question in the chat as it's come through, but we are out of time and we'll deal with those separately as part of the onwards process. David,
thank you very much, Oliver.
Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much. Good night to you all.